everyone. Welcome to another C2C Care webinar. My name is Robin Bauer-Kilgo. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen real quick. Like Mike said, feel free to say hello, say where you're from. As always, I am in the Florida Keys where it continues to be hot. So that does never change. It's just hot and humid here. So today we are here for our second in our May Day prep series, Sustainability as Disaster Preparation. I'm just going to go through a couple of quick slides and then we're going to hand this over to our presenters today. Again, my name is Robin Bauer-Kilgo. I am the C2C Care coordinator, and you just saw Mike Marno, who's our senior producer at Learning Times. If at any point during the webinar you have any questions about the technical aspects, go ahead and throw it down there in the chat and we will get to you as soon as possible. If you haven't already been to it, this is our home on the web, connecting to collections.org. On that website, you will find a huge archive of programming. We've been doing webinars for onwards of 10 years now. So you'll find the entire archives of that, archives of our courses as well, which are in-depth looks at different collections care objects or topics of different kinds. Also our curated resources and a link to our community, which is a moderated community where you can ask questions about collections care. So if you haven't gone to it, I encourage you to go there. We also put future programming on that website. So as always, go check that out if you want to sign up for anything in the future. We also have two places that we're on social media, which is on Facebook and Twitter. On there, we put announcements of upcoming programming. So as always, we encourage you to follow us if you're on either one of those bits of social media. Like Mike said, there are two ways that you can communicate with us when it comes to the program today. I think most of us are pretty comfortable when it comes to Zoom and Zoom platform, but we always like to review that the chat is there for you to say hello, let us know how you're doing, or if you have a technical question. If you have a question for any of our speakers at any point during the programming, I encourage you to put them in the Q&A box. It just allows us to actually keep track of the questions throughout the time period. Quick note on upcoming webinars for C2C Care. In June, we're going to be doing one on the care of musical instruments, which I know sounds probably a little niche, but at the same time, I think there's a lot of us out there who work with smaller collections that you have a random musical instrument in there. So we have a speaker coming to us from Mexico who we're very excited to have, who specializes in this. She's a conservator. So we're really going to be looking at how we store these things, how we maintain them, how we care for them. So I would encourage you to sign up for this webinar. If it's coming up. We'll also be announcing pretty shortly some webinars in July and August. They should be opened up for registration soon. Right now, the planned one for July is on security issues. And in August, in honor of it being hurricane and fire season, we're going to be doing some hurricane and fire webinars featuring some folks who have lived through those experiences. That'll be happening in mid-August. So I would encourage you to keep an eye on our website to sign up for those. Now I'm going to go ahead and hand this over real quick to my colleague, Elena Gregg, who's the Emergencies Program Coordinator for FAIC, and she's going to talk a little bit about May Day prep.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. As Robin mentioned, today's webinar is part of FAIC's May Day programming. Each year, we encourage cultural organizations to do something during the month of May to enhance their disaster preparedness. And activities could include reviewing your emergency plan, taking steps to write an emergency plan for the first time, training staff on emergency procedures, practicing your institution's phone tree or means of communicating with your staff, or attending an emergency-related program such as today's webinar. So if you've completed an activity or plan to complete one today, since this is the last day of the May Day month, just take a minute to fill out the survey that I'm going to put in the chat momentarily. By entering into our survey contest, you'll have a chance to win one of FAIC's emergency resources, including the Emergency Response and Salvage Wheel, the Field Guide to Disaster Response, or a registration to a Connecting to Collections Care course. So thanks again, and I'm going to hand it back over to Robin.
Thanks, Elena. And I also need to step back. I forgot to do my land acknowledgement at the beginning of the program. So I would like to acknowledge that this webinar is being moderated on the traditional lands of the Miccosukee and Seminole people and their ancestors. And I pay my respect to elders, both past and present, as we do our program today. So we have 3 speakers lined up for today. We will be doing about 20-25 minutes per presentation and then be open up for a Q&A afterwards, all based on this idea of sustainability when it comes to emergency prep and disaster preparation. Our first speaker is Lorraine Finch. She's a conservator and chair of the ICON Environmental Sustainability Network. And she also has a book coming out that we're going to put some information down in the chat about that in the future. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen. I'm going to go ahead and let Lorraine take over, and we will see you as we progress through the speakers today and also at the Q&A afterwards. Thanks. And Lorraine, feel free to start whenever you're ready. Oop, Lorraine, looks like you're muted, so you might want to unmute your mic.
Right, I'll start again then. So good morning, everybody, or good evening, depending on where you are. I'm going to be talking to you today about sustainable salvage and how to reduce your environmental impact of your emergency kit. So if you just give me 1 second, I'm just going to share my screen. So, as I said, what I'm talking about today is how to reduce the environmental impact of your emergency kit. But before I do that, I want to tell you a story. So Great Yarmouth, which is where I'm based, is a port and a seaside town, as you can see from this map. Great Yarmouth is situated on a sandbar. So you have the river on one side and the sea on the other. Now you can appreciate from both of these maps that the biggest threat to heritage in Great Yarmouth comes from water. Now that's not necessarily water in terms of torrential downpours or from rainfall, although rainfall and the heaviness of the rainfall in the town has increased in recent years due to climate change. But as I say, our biggest threat in terms of water is our traditional threat, which is the river and the sea in the form of tidal surges. Now, Great Yarmouth for centuries was a major port. It was a very wealthy town. Now, if you are a wealthy merchant, where do you build your merchant's house? You build it on the quayside, next to where all the trade is. And this is the quay in Great Yarmouth. You can see those merchants' houses standing there. Great Yarmouth's fortunes as a port declined in the 20th century. And a lot of these properties, the merchants' houses, became empty and derelict. The question then is, well, what do you do with a property that is empty and decaying? And the answer is, you put a museum in it. Now, the last tidal surge we had in Great Yarmouth was in December 2017. The river overtopped the flood barriers and it came up the drains. Now, river water in itself is none too pleasant, but now it's contaminated with sewage. It has a biohazard in it. As I said, the museums, being in the former merchants' houses, they are situated on the quayside, so they're at the front line of this water. The museums are fitted with flood barriers, flood defences, and they did put them into place because they were forewarned that a tidal surge was happening. So you can see here, this is the front entrance of one of the museums, and there are two slots either side of the doorway. Into that, you slip a metal panel, and behind that, you put sandbags to slow down the ingress of water into the building. However, the water still got in, and the irony is, the only thing that was damaged was the emergency kit. Very sensibly, the museum curators had put the emergency kit near the front door, because what do you do when there's a disaster? You go in through the front door and the emergency kit is there for you to grab whatever you need. But unfortunately, it was the only thing that was damaged by the floodwater. Now remember, this is floodwater contaminated with biohazard. So therefore, the entire emergency kit had to be disposed of unused. It couldn't even be recycled because it was contaminated. Now that is a waste of money. It's a waste of resources, and it has a climate and environmental impact. Now, that illustrates our current attitude, society's current attitude to stuff, which is take, make, and waste. So we take resources from the natural world, we make things from it, and then we waste them. Now, in order to be sustainable, we need to change this to the 4 R's, which are refuse, reduce, reuse, and recycle. To fit with these 4 R's and to make your emergency kit more sustainable, what do you need to do? Well, let's look at that. So the first thing to do is to look at what you've got. What do you have in your disaster kit? What equipment and materials are in it, and how much of them do you have? When I was looking through previous disaster plans that I picked up from museums and archives around the UK, one disaster plan listed 72 different pieces of equipment and materials that they had in their disaster kit. And of these, they had multiples. So they might, for example, have had 10 boxes of gloves and 15 Tyvek suits and 7 pairs of wellies. Another disaster plan listed 50 different items of equipment and materials. Again, most of which they had multiples for. So if you look at that, how many items do they have? The amount of items they have run into hundreds. Now, auditing your emergency kit is going to allow you to decide whether you need all of it or not. And you should consider whether you need all of the items in your disaster kit. Have you used the items? If so, which ones have you used? Could you rationalize your kit? If you can, which items can you remove? Do you have items which can be removed and used elsewhere and only purchased in the event of a disaster when you actually need them? For example, full face respirators and half face respirators, you can purchase those at short notice from building suppliers, and you can add a link in your emergency plan so that when you need them, you've got the details of where to go to get those pieces of material as and when you require them. And I'll give you an example here. So just before Christmas of last year, I was due to go to a museum to carry out a mold clean in their store. Everything was in place. I had my train ticket, all the supplies were packed up. I booked my hotel. The curator had been briefed, he'd been sent a list of the PPE that we required in order to carry out the mold clean. About 2 days before we were all due to start, I get an email from him saying, "Oh, I can't get the stuff. The conservation suppliers are sold out and they don't have any more stock." So I said, okay, don't worry about that. How about trying one of the local building suppliers? We have a company called Screwfix. So about 20 minutes later, I get a much calmer email saying, "Oh, I went on the Screwfix website. I've got everything." So it is that easy to pick up your PPE. It's so much easier now than it ever used to be. So once you know what you have, the next thing to do is identify what it's made of. So is it made of paper? Is it made of plastic? Is it made of textiles? Is it made of rubber? Now, one reason for identifying what it's made from is that different materials are going to age differently. We all know this. So some are going to age more quickly than others. And so therefore you might want to purchase items made from a different material, or again, purchase them only when they're required. And that's going to allow you to make choices about purchasing the most sustainable option. So for example, natural rubber wellies, they are more sustainable, but they are going to degrade more quickly than those made from plastic. So it might be that for you, the better option is to choose Wellington boots that are made from recycled plastic. Now, this is a company in the UK called Shoezone. They're a high street company, so you don't have to go to a specialist. And as you can see, they sell recycled Wellington boots. So Wellington boots that are made of recycled materials. And so this is where I'd like the first poll to be launched, please, because the question I have for you is, how many items in your disaster kit are made from recycled materials? Do you know? Now, I can't see anybody voting, so somebody's going to have to prompt me when everybody has voted. What are the answers coming in?
So right now there's a lot of don't knows, which is not surprising at all. There's some don't knows, and I'll check. It looks like far fewer are in the yes category right now. I think predominantly it's a lot of don't knows.
Okay, can we share the results? Is that okay? There we are. All is revealed. So 8% of you say yes, you've got recycled materials, 22% no, 52% don't know, and a glorious 18% don't know, but you're going to check, which is fantastic. So that's really quite illuminating. Thank you very much for sharing that. So many of your items in your disaster kit can actually be made from materials that are either 100% recycled or have a percentage of recycled content. So for example, things like your mops and your buckets, they can have recycled content. And also some of your PPE, some PPE suppliers are now supplying PPE which has recycled content or is made from 100% recycled material. So I'll share this one with you. It's a company called Clad Safety. They have a very limited range at the moment, but that's only going to grow. So do shop around and do see if you can find materials for your disaster kits that is made from recycled materials. Now, we need to use more items that are made from recycled materials. Currently, more materials are sent for recycling than are made from recycled materials because there's little demand for those products. And we need to change this to ensure that these materials are being made into new products. And that's going to prevent materials being incinerated, going into landfill, or being shipped somewhere else where they become somebody else's problem. Now, this is a photograph from The Guardian, which is UK waste, or I should say UK recycling, that was shipped to Turkey for recycling and has been dumped and is being burnt. Now, this comes from UK households who, in all good faith, put this material into their recycling bins. It's been collected by the local council, and now it's being burnt in Turkey. And although this is a UK example, it doesn't take much looking on the internet to find exactly the same examples for the US. So this is why we need to create this demand for recycled materials in order to stop this happening. So I have a plea here. This is my plea to you. Please buy more products with a recycled content, and let's start creating that demand. So another way of creating sustainability in your emergency kit is to consider the shelf life and expiry date of the materials within it. Now, many of the materials within your disaster kits are going to have expiry dates. So for example, here in the UK with hard hats, we have a manufacturer's recommendation that they should be disposed of or replaced after 5 years, which makes perfect sense if you are working on a building site where your hard hat is taking knocks and bangs every day. But for most of us, our hard hats sit in our disaster kits and they don't get used. They don't see the light of day for the 5 years that they are in there. It's not a British standard, this 5 years. It's not an international standard. It's a manufacturer's recommendation. So I say it's not a manufacturer's requirement. It's a manufacturer's recommendation. But all organisations dispose of their hard hats after 5 years because their concern is that they will face legal challenge if the staff use a hard hat and are then injured. Now, I pose a question to you. Should we challenge this? Should we challenge this mindset? Because it is leading to perfectly good PPE being disposed of with a subsequent climate cost. And again, Robin, you'll need to prompt me, please.
Just launched the poll.
Thank you. I can see that. Yeah, that's brilliant. And I can't vote.
No, as a panelist, you're unable to, unfortunately.
Darn. I can't rig it. So how are we getting on?
I think overwhelmingly, it looks like a yes.
Excellent.
Let it slow down here in a little bit. It's like 93% yes, 7% no. So I think that most people
well, I think we can say which way we're voting there. That's fairly conclusive, isn't it? Thank you very much. So that's brilliant. Thank you, everyone. So there we are. 93% of you said yes, we need to challenge this mindset over disposing of usable PPE. That's brilliant. Thank you. So other things within, or other items within your disaster kits, which are going to have a short shelf life, are things like disposable masks and batteries. So again, these may be things that are disposed of before they are ever used. And just as we considered whether we need everything in the kit, think about whether you need a large quantity of these materials or whether you can just have a few. And then, as we said earlier, buy them as and when required. Now, here's a tip for your batteries. When you are able, as and when it happens, remove the batteries and replace them with ones that are rechargeable, and add a solar charger to your emergency kit. When you have your emergency kit audit day, make sure that part of that you have a recharge day. And you can also add wind up torches into your emergency kit also. So another hint for you here about how to make your disaster kit more sustainable is think about the location. We have that excellent example at the beginning about, with the greatest bit of planning, it was the only thing that got affected in the emergency when the disaster struck. So think about where your disaster kit is stored. Is it next to a hot radiator, which is causing the items to deteriorate more quickly? Is it stored next to a window where the sun comes streaming through and therefore everything is deteriorating faster? And another thing, check out whether you can share. Is it possible for you to share items within your disaster kit with other museums, with other archives, with other libraries, so you don't get that duplication? And identify what you can reuse and what you can recycle. So it's possible to reuse and recycle items in your kit, and here are some examples. So even if you've used the supplies in your emergency kit to deal with a disaster, it may be possible to clean and reuse them. So things like gloves, you can wash gloves, microfiber cloths, you can wash those. You can clean out your mops and your buckets and wash off your Wellington boots. You can also wash Tyvek suits. And I thought that I would give this a go. I'd done a clean and I had a nice black stripe across my midriff, where the dirt had accumulated across my midriff. And I thought, okay, I'm going to try this. I hear that you can wash Tyvek suits, but I've never done it. So I put it in the washing machine. Works really well. However, my hint for you here is make sure you stand by with a bucket when you remove your Tyvek suit or suits from the washing machine, because Tyvek is not absorbent and therefore it will stream water everywhere. So you need to put it into a bucket straight away, take it outside and let it drip dry. And the other thing is they smell absolutely awful whilst they're drying, but thankfully they dry without the smell. But it does work. You can wash and reuse Tyvek suits. Now, PPE can be recycled. So there's several recycling schemes available. So gloves can be recycled through TerraCycle, but there is a cost to that. So you have to be able to know that you're generating enough gloves for it to make financial sense to purchase the TerraCycle box. And PPE purchased from Kimtech, so the suits, the goggles, the gloves, they can all be recycled through a Kimtech scheme that's run through TerraCycle. However, they will only take Kimtech branded products. Gloves, you could, like I say, can be recycled, but if you can, reuse them. So if it is possible to reuse your gloves, you could maybe fill them with sand and use them as weights. You can cut off the cuffs and use those as rubber bands. If your gloves are still usable, but no longer suitable for using around the workplace, take them home and use them for the mucky jobs that you've got at home. Hard hats can be recycled via the Yes Recycling scheme. But again, there's a fee for that. There's a subscription fee to pay, and that's based on the size of your organisation. Hard hats, which are used or other out-of-date workwear, you could donate those to a children's play scheme so they could use those for dressing up. Hard hats could maybe be used as a planter in the garden, so you can put your plants in there, your herbs next to the door. And I've even seen hard hats hung up and used as bird feeders and little bird houses. So there's quite a lot of inventive ways that you can reuse your no longer usable PPE. And Wellington boots, of course, you see those quite a lot of being used as planters. Now, if you have any materials that you're deaccessioning from your collection, do keep them and use them for your disaster training days. You could ask staff to bring in bits and pieces from home if they've got stuff at home, photographs and newspapers that they don't want, to bring in for your disaster training days. And even better, you could use that as community engagement. You could say to your community, we really need old photographs so that we can practice how to rescue photographs from the water. And that's a really good way to get people to know about what you're doing and how you care for your collections. And don't forget the sundries. So think about all of the sundries that you use relating to your emergency planning. So for example, your emergency plan itself, how many pages does it have? Do you print it out? When you update it, do you print out just the page that you've updated, or do you print out the whole thing? The carbon footprint of one sheet from a laser printer is 5.5 grams of CO2 equivalent, which doesn't sound like a lot. But if you've got a 60-page emergency plan with 15 people printing that up, that really does add up to quite a lot. So that's a run through of how to make your emergency kit more sustainable. So look at what you've got, reduce what you have, and reuse and recycle. And I have one final thing for you, a challenge. So my challenge to you is, what one sustainability action will you take today to reduce the impact of your emergency kit? And I would like you to type that in the chat, please. If anybody wants to get hold of me, these are all of my contact details. You could also contact me at sustainability.icon@gmail.com, and I'll put that in the chat for you so you don't have to think I had to scribble that down too quickly. And I would like to say thank you to my team member, Lynn Teggett, who works alongside me on the Environmental Sustainability Network, and she shared with me her tips on sustainability and salvage, which formed the basis of my presentation today. So thank you very much, Lynn, and thank you all to you for listening.
Thanks, Lorraine. And I'm going to encourage people to keep putting items in the chat, and we'll go over those during the Q&A, because I think it's really fun to read of the ways that people doing those little small actions, which are always the way we start this, right, within your facility or your institution, to kind of make little changes is always a good impact in the long run. I'm also putting in the chat a link to Lorraine's book, which is Low Cost, No Cost Tips for Sustainability and Cultural Heritage. It's she's holding it up. So if anyone's interested in that, feel free to take a look at that as well. So we're going to go ahead and move on to our next speaker. Her name is Krista Pack. She is conservator at the Missouri Historical Society. Krista, feel free to take over whenever you are ready.
All right, thank you, Robin. And Lorraine, I can answer your challenge. I'm going to go check our disaster kits and see what is recyclable in them, because I've never thought about that. That was great. Thank you. Let me get this up. Beginning. All right, well, thank you everyone for giving me this opportunity today to talk about our sustainability initiatives here at the Missouri Historical Society. I'd like to begin my talk today with just a short introduction to our organization. The Missouri Historical Society, or MHS for short, is located in St. Louis in Missouri, and we've been a part of the St. Louis community for over 150 years now. We have 3 entities, which you see represented here on the screen. On the left is the Missouri History Museum, which first opened to the public in 1913 and is actually built on the site of the entrance to the 1904 World's Fair. Second, and pictured on the right, is our Library and Research Center, or the LRC. And this is actually where I work, and it houses our library, our archives, and the majority of our collection storage. And finally, here in the center, we have the Soldiers Memorial Military Museum, which we operate in partnership with the city of St. Louis. All of our public-facing entities are LEED certified, and LEED stands for Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. And Soldiers Memorial is additionally True Zero Waste certified, and TRUE stands for Total Resource Use and Efficiency. One of the core concepts for sustainability is the triple bottom line. The triple bottom line is a sustainability framework that measures a business's success in terms of 3 key areas, and these are people, planet, and profit. These areas are also sometimes referred to as social, environmental, and governance, but then we lose our P alliteration, which is really important to us, especially in the cultural industry, because we can expand the triple bottom line and add a 4th P, and that is the preservation of cultural materials and cultural sites, which for us is really just as important as people, planet, and profit. So what this means is that our methods for cultural preservation play a huge role in supporting people, planet, and profit. The sustainability model that we follow at MHS is made up of 4 main components that you see here. One is green building certifications, which for us has been pursuing the LEED and the True Zero Waste certifications that I mentioned earlier. Another component is community collaborations. For this, we've partnered not only with other cultural sites in St. Louis, but also with several green building community partners, such as the US Green Building Council. We also try to build a culture of sharing, which we've done in the form of conducting case studies and sharing information through our organizational website, as well as presenting at cultural industry conferences. In this way, we really aim to build a culture of sharing sustainability data across the industry. And lastly, MHS has built a culture of employee engagement, which started many, many years ago with our staff organized Green Committee. And it continues today through fun employee workshops and incentives that we do to help build green literacy within our organization. So why do we do this? Well, natural disasters greatly impact not only our collections, but also the communities in which we collect. So from our perspective, there are really 5 important reasons why we as collections professionals need to look at our current practices within the cultural industry to help mitigate these climate-induced disasters. So first is the current state of the environment. We all know that the intensity of climate-induced disasters and the overall changing of our weather patterns, they're really beginning to impact our collections practices. For example, in recent years here in the Midwest, we've seen increases in the frequency of major heat waves, and not just increases in the frequency, but increases in temperatures and increases in the duration of these heat waves. We've also seen increased humidity levels and extreme rain and flooding events. Attempting to maintain indoor temperature and RH levels within any kind of acceptable parameter for the preservation of artifacts now comes at an increased energy cost as our HVAC systems are working harder and for longer periods to maintain our desired ranges. Our second reason is that our practices not only impact our immediate workplace or region, but they impact all cultural institutions, large and small, around the world. The challenges of the increased temperature and humidity, well, they're hard for us to deal with, but they're even more detrimental to our colleagues who work to preserve collections in historic buildings, and they may not be able to maintain climate control. So now they must face the challenges of increased mold, increased pest activity, and faster rates of degradation in their materials. And in coastal towns, many are now faced with the challenges of rising sea levels and have to look at moving collections to higher ground and elevating historic homes due to climate change. And there's an example of this you see on the screen. This is a case study from the Keeping History Above Water conference. And if you haven't visited that site, historyabovewater.org, I recommend it because it's really interesting and eye-opening. Third, one of our main objectives as conservators and collection specialists is the preservation and conservation of cultural heritage. So if we take that concept further, we should also be concerned with conserving the environment and the communities from which we have acquired these cultural materials. And then furthermore, to our fourth point, it's really through the generosity and support of our communities that we're even able to continue preserving history in the first place. So as cultural institutions, we should strive to be great stewards by practicing environmental sustainability strategies to help lessen the impact of climate-induced disasters on our communities. And finally, we also have an obligation to serve our industry, not to just look for ways to reduce our impact on the environment and to reduce consumption and waste practices, but to then share those strategies with each other. At MHS, we often talk about our efforts to pursue green building certifications. These are great and we're really proud of them, as we should be, but they are certainly not the only path to becoming environmentally responsible within a cultural site. We implemented green building certifications because we had a sustainability professional on staff and on site that specialized in that area of sustainability. And we realized that not everyone's going to have access to that. And a lot of the methods we have chosen to pursue do require time, technical skill sets, staff involvement, and capital funds to implement. However, when we look at the activities and the principles required to pursue green building certifications, well, a lot of them can actually be applied at any site, large or small, and often at no or at least little cost to an institution. So first, we're going to look at LEED green building certifications and the principles behind that. The LEED certification rating system focuses on the following areas that are outlined here on your screen, and these include things like energy efficiency, waste diversion, water consumption. You can see them all listed there. At our institution, the LRC and the Missouri History Museum are both LEED certified silver, and Soldiers Memorial is LEED certified gold. And to do this, we really focus, especially at the museum and at the LRC, we focused heavily on improving indoor air quality and a lot of energy spent on energy efficiency at these buildings. And I'm not going to go fully into all the details of the LEED certification here, but I am going to share some activities from 3 of these LEED ratings areas that we think really any organization can do. So first we'll look at energy efficiency. So one thing you can do is look for government incentives and rebates that will help you replace non-LED lighting for LED for free. So we applied for a program that covered the cost of replacing our fluorescent lights throughout our buildings with LED tubes. And we were able to greatly improve our energy efficiency at minimal cost to the museum. And you can look for these incentives and rebates at the local level, but also at state and federal level. So there's really a lot of opportunities out there that you can pursue. And to go even simpler though, you can just encourage practices such as turning off the lights as you leave storerooms or really any room. But it's good practice for the storerooms because it minimizes the artifact's exposure to light, which is good. And it's energy efficient too. And the image here is inside of one of our storerooms. We have multiple banks of lights within our storeroom. So we encourage our staff to not only turn the lights off when they leave, but when they enter to only turn on the bank of lights that they need to use to do their activity, and then to turn everything off when they leave. And then finally, when it's time to purchase new equipment, always make sure you're getting Energy Star rated appliances. Now, the other area I want to look at is waste diversion. And I feel like this one's kind of overly simple, but it was an important one because one of the goals with certification was simply to set up a waste system that allows you to visibly differentiate between landfill and recycling. We already had that to some degree, a lot of people do, but this motivated us to make sure we were consistent with it throughout our buildings. And there's no need to buy new waste systems. Just use what you have and label them really well so that you are properly recycling and properly placing items in the landfill too. And to some degree, this involves reviewing your local recycling policies, because if you're placing non-recyclable items into your recycle bins, you'll actually end up doing more harm than good. And we had a workshop on this a few years ago, and it was really eye-opening for me. And I realized during that workshop that I was a hopeful recycler. And I admit that freely because I think a lot of us tend to be. And what I mean by that is if there was an item that I wasn't sure it could be recycled, I would kind of hope that it could and put it in the recycling bin, hoping for the best. And what we learned in that workshop is that if you do that, that's considered contaminating your recycling bin. And then everything goes to the landfill, not just the thing that you weren't sure about. And they scared us even further by saying, not only will your entire bin go to the landfill, but you can end up contaminating the entire truck. And so then that entire truck of things that might have been recycled is now going to the landfill. So I'm no longer a hopeful recycler, and I always say, when in doubt, throw it out. And then finally, we'll look at materials here a little bit. Recycling, again, what you can is important, but so is reducing your consumption overall by not taking on more materials than you need. And then reusing whatever you can. I always say it's fairly easy to be sustainable in collections and conservation because a lot of us have pretty small budgets. So we need to conserve and reuse our supplies out of necessity. And the image here is our scrap bins at the labs at the LRC. And I don't think I've ever been in a collections or conservation room that did not have boxes and boxes of scraps because we try to reuse everything we can. The key takeaway here is that there are simple steps that any organization can take, whether large or small, to implement and adhere to sustainability practices. So the other certification we pursued is True Zero Waste certification. This is administered by the Green Business Certification Incorporated, and it's considered a complement to LEED and other green rating systems. As you can see on the screen, it involves a lot of R's. So zero waste principles focus primarily on redesigning your practices to reduce the amount of waste you take on in the first place, similar to what we talked about with LEED waste principles. And one way that I've tried to reduce waste in our lab a little bit is to consolidate supply orders to one supplier as much as possible. And this has been a bit challenging for me because I'm a bargain shopper and I've always strived to get the best possible price on each material I buy. And we still have to do that to some degree because it's not like our budgets have grown exponentially. But now when I'm ordering, I make sure to consider whether the cost savings is really significant enough to justify increased packaging and the increased amount of fuel that is necessary for multiple deliveries. And I've also worked hard to try to consolidate amounts of deliveries to fewer per year. So instead of ordering every other month, now I'm trying to only order once per quarter. If we move down this list, again, many of us are already accustomed to reusing, repairing, and repurposing the materials in our workplaces, so I'm not going to go any further into those. And when it comes to recycling, it's also important to think about items that must be thrown away and whether or not you've used those materials to the fullest potential. So an example we like to use for this is paper towels. If your department or institution buys paper towels, did you buy them from recycled materials? That means they're already on their second life and so can no longer be used after we use them. So it's just really a good way to think about utilizing materials to their fullest potential. Zero waste is a newer concept for buildings, but it's a concept that is just as important as we talk about climate mitigation practices, since waste greatly impacts climate change just as energy and water reduction do. And then finally, just to touch on the last point on this slide, we often get questions about re-earth, which is composting. We practice composting at the Missouri History Museum, which is where our restaurant is located. And we also often have outdoor concerts and other events outside on the grounds of the museum. So now we have composting bins that are placed alongside trash and recycling bins at these events to help encourage our visitors to compost what they can. And we do have a Q&A on our zero waste practices that's available on YouTube. If you go to YouTube and just Google our museum, you should be able to find it pretty easily, but there'll also be a link in the resource page that you all will have access to. And then finally, outside of certifications, engagement is really a top priority for our sustainability initiatives at MHS. It's important to make sustainability practices inclusive to all in an organization. And honestly, we really don't recommend trying to take on going green only in collections or only in conservation, because it can end up hindering your impact and will really burden you with a heavier load than what many of us already carry. So reach out to other departments like your facilities and leadership teams and gather support to help make changes. Partnering with other departments in your institution can also help if you can share the financial costs of buying environmentally friendly products and services. So see if facilities or operations or someone can help absorb the cost of recycling materials like nitrile gloves that can't go into a city's recycling bin. And I know we talked a little bit about nitrile gloves earlier in programs like TerraCycle, which is what we use at our museum. If you're looking at, if that seems like a good fit for your institution, but you start calculating how many boxes you need and the cost seems overwhelming, I would just say, remember that it's not all or nothing. Even if all you can do is one small box, and whenever that gets filled up, you send that off. If every institution just did one small box, that can really add up to make a really big change in the end. And then finally, it's also important to build partnerships in the community outside of the museum industry to help achieve your sustainability goals. This is even more important for those of us that work at small sites or working with small budgets. Find organizations outside of your institution that can help you take on green tasks. In St. Louis, we've utilized our local chapter of the Green Building Council because they offer free benchmarking sessions to help you reduce your energy costs. They also offer free green educational programs that cover topics such as waste, lighting, interior building conditions, and so much more. Again, the reference page that you have access to will have a list of some of those places where you can gather resources. But again, engagement is a huge component to greening your department and your institution and building strong partnerships within your community. So here are some of the references that I mentioned. Again, these will be made available to you, so you don't have to try to write them all down. If you don't see a reference that I mentioned, just reach out to me and I'll be sure to get in touch with you with any information I can find or have access to. And here's my contact information if you need to reach out later on with questions or want any more information. Thank you.
Thanks, Krista. We appreciate that. And it was, like I said, it was funny when you were talking about the cart with all the leftover bits on it. Like every place I've been to has that.
Everybody has that. Yeah.
Yeah. And especially since now I'm an independent contractor, I have certain supplies sitting around my house and my office. And now my son will steal them to integrate them into train displays, which I'm like, well, you're reusing them and I can't use that in the foam. So cool. It's very funny. So anyway, well, thank you again. And if anyone, I saw some really good comments and stuff in the chat, so we'll hit those again when we do the Q&A period here in a little bit. So now I'm going to go ahead and introduce our final speaker today. Their name is Al Carver-Cubic, the research scientist at the Image Permanence Institute. Al, whenever you're ready, feel free to start your presentation.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you very much. I'm happy to be here. In September of 2020, Image Permanence Institute was awarded funding from the Institute of Museum and Library Services here in the US to research the most cost-efficient and environmentally responsible methods of preparing paper-based objects for transit and display. Objects are at their greatest risk when they're in use and being handled. This graph here is from the 2019 Heritage Health Information Survey, indicating that a large amount of damage or loss in museums is due to handling. And this is particularly to museums, but they're on this in the information survey report. Libraries and archives and other institutions, collecting institutions, also see a lot of loss and damage due to handling. And handling may include preparing objects for display in transit, as well as handling by researchers and so on. And so we tend to put a lot of effort into safeguarding objects in preparing them for transit, particularly safeguarding them from handling, as well as from environmental conditions. There are many, many, many ways in which objects might be damaged in transit. It could be due to shock and vibration, incorrect relative humidity, incorrect temperature, IR radiation from radiant heat, even improper packing and proper handling, as well as water ingress. Things can be, fragile surfaces can be broken. You can have cleavage or loss to other fragile surfaces like paintings. Three-dimensional objects can be sensitive to moisture. Paper-based objects are also sensitive to moisture and planar distortion. And of course, there's always abrasion. A lot of research has gone into constructing shipping crates that protect objects while in transit, particularly focused on preparing paintings and three-dimensional objects for transit. But there isn't a lot of research regarding how to best prepare paper-based objects for transit. And so that is the focus of our project, is the best way to protect paper-based objects. And again, according to the Heritage Health Information Survey, about 77% of collections are classified as paper-based objects, which includes photographs and what they call unbound sheets, which includes documents, prints, drawings, and so forth, as well as bound volumes. Paper-based objects are particularly sensitive to changes in moisture content due to fluctuations in relative humidity as well as temperature. Paper objects can expand and contract as they gain and lose moisture. And this can result in planar distortions like cockling, which is seen in this image here. And this is particularly true when paper-based objects are restrained, which is often how they're prepared for transit. We tend to put paper-based objects mounted to a support board with corners or hinges, and then they're often also placed in frames, all of which sort of restrain them. It restricts their movement as their moisture content changes. And so when preparing paper-based objects for transit and display, a lot of effort is put into ensuring objects remain physically stable. A major way that we do this is to protect them is by putting them in sealed frame packages. Sealed frame packages are microenvironments, which help to maintain a constant moisture content. And so what we have here is a little diagram, a picture of a sealed frame package and a diagram. And so you'll have your mat package, if it's a matted object, with the objects inside, a backing board, a waterproof or vapor-proof barrier sheet, as well as a seal, and then of course some kind of glazing. And all of this is meant to protect the object from changes in moisture content. There are a lot of variations in designs and materials, and there isn't a lot of research done to date on the effectiveness of the sealed frame packages. The packages then are placed into shipping crates. They're typically a plywood or plastic construction. They're tightly packed. There's very little airspace. They're packed horizontally or vertically. So we can actually see in this diagram, this is an example of horizontal packing in trays, and there's padding around the object. A little cavity is created with padding around the object. The object is actually wrapped in a bag, which is also very common. And then they're stacked on top of each other. And so this packing environment is also a microenvironment. The crate microenvironment is better understood for paintings, but we tend to create paper-based objects a little bit differently than paintings. And so the interior environment of shipping crates for paper-based objects has not thoroughly been researched. And based on previous research at IPI, we believe that the internal RH of the crates may be fairly stable during transit. And this is something that we're researching. And so our research question is, what are the most cost-efficient and environmentally responsible methods of preparing paper-based collection objects for transit and display while maintaining our preservation standards? And with that, we will investigate the microenvironments created using sealed frame packages and shipping crates for paper-based objects. By studying the buffering capacity of crate and crate packing materials, we will also be able to determine when sealed frame packages are necessary. And by studying the vapor barrier capacity of materials commonly used to make sealed frame packages, we will be able to determine what materials best meet our preservation goals. So our project goals are to collect and analyze data pertaining to the shipping crate environment in transit, which includes the buffering capacity of the shipping crate and packing configurations, the materials, design, and construction of sealed frame packages. We're doing this by doing both lab research as well as field research. So the lab element includes conducting 2 questionnaires to identify materials commonly used to create sealed frame packages and materials used to construct and pack shipping crates. Each material is being tested to ensure it will not cause any damage to collection objects in contact or near the materials. We're using the international ISO 18902 standard for photo safety. We're also looking at moisture diffusion rates of materials, thermal insulating capacity of materials used in shipping crates. And we're also looking to identify and test alternative environmentally responsible materials. With the field research, we have 11 partner institutions with various modes of transit, air and ground, primarily, within different climatic regions in the United States, as well as Europe, and throughout different seasons. And so what we're doing is we're giving them temperature and humidity data loggers to place inside their shipping crates, as well as one on the exterior of the shipping crate to collect real world data. So at this stage of our project, we have completed the sealed frame package and crate construction questionnaires, and we have acquired nearly all of the materials we will test based on the results of the questionnaires, and we're in our second round of testing sealed frame packages. So we have quite a bit of data there already, and we've begun to test crate construction materials, and we'll soon begin to test the various packing materials. So the questionnaire results of the sealed frame package were that we had 109 respondents. Museums represented over half of the respondents. 80% of the respondents were in North America, with respondents from Europe, Asia, and Oceania as well. And 70% of the respondents were conservators. The most common materials that are used in the sealed frame package, because here's again is our diagram, for the backing board was primarily corrugated plastic, better known as Coroplast under that brand name. A lot of people also used blue board, acrylic, and foam board or foam core. The glazing was primarily acrylic. The vapor-proof barrier was primarily aluminized nylon and polyethylene barrier film, also known as Marvel seal. And the tape seal was primarily aluminum foil tape, although polypropylene tape was also very commonly used, better known under the trade name of JLAR. The crates questionnaire, the results showed that 76%, or so that we had 76 respondents, and again, museums represented over half of the respondents. And the majority of the respondents were also in North America. The most common materials were 1/2-inch plywood, primarily birch, and medium density overlay or MDO, which are often sealed either with paint, joint caulking, or both. And I'd like to note just 17% use forest certified wood, or forest, sorry, steward certified wood, FSC. Many respondents said that they line their crates with marble seal to mitigate off-gassing of the plywood. Padding and insulation, the primary material is polyethylene foam, better known under the trade name of Ethafoam. Those who use trays, like in the diagram, commonly use a foam board, and the cavity is created using, again, Ethafoam. And many reported that they do wrap their objects in bags. As part of our questionnaire, we asked about reuse and recycling of crates as well as the packing material. And I'm very, very happy to report that most respondents store and reuse their crates, whether they're wooden or plastic. There are some caveats. While only 2.6% of our 76 respondents were art packing and shipping companies, we do know that they likely build and pack the majority of crates that are used in the field. And based on the conversations that I've had with representatives from this industry, we also understand that they may be less likely to store and reuse crate and packing materials. This is not true across the board. It's becoming more and more common for this industry to reuse materials, repurpose materials, recycle materials, to the best of their ability. We also asked about reusing and repurposing and recycling of the packing material. And you can see here in our chart, the majority of people, or very, very many people, reuse and repurpose materials. Very few actually recycle materials. Many pointed out that there were barriers to recycling that they found, or materials were not recyclable. And with that said, there's still quite a bit of material that goes into the landfill. We can only reuse and repurpose our materials to a certain extent. There's sort of a finite amount of times we can actually reuse something. And so in the end, I imagine after repurposing and reusing, a lot of that does inevitably end up in the landfill. And so this begs the question of, why do we care? Why are we so concerned about the environmental sustainability of crate construction packing materials, as well as sealed frame packages? I can't say that the production of plywood is particularly harmful to the environment. It leads to deforestation, air pollution, water pollution, soil pollution. The operation of creating plywood uses a lot of fossil fuel. I did a little screenshot from the Stitch website, Sustainability Tools and Cultural Heritage. They have a great carbon calculator, and here shows the carbon footprint of the production of 1 cubic meter of birch plywood. And that leads to 471.9 kilograms in carbon dioxide. That's really quite a bit. So why do we care about plastics? Plastics are non-biodegradable, but they do photodegrade, which means that the sun breaks them up into teeny tiny little pieces, which we know end up in oceans, rivers, lakes, in our food sources, as well as in human body. And so here are some very, very recent studies that have come out that are finding microplastics in our blood, in our lungs, as well as in fetuses. The other issue that is kind of a more invisible issue are the plasticizers, particularly phthalates, which are endocrine disruptors. And there's robust evidence that phthalates lead to lower semen quality, problems with neurodevelopment, childhood asthma, and anogenital distance in boys. And what one resource declared as the devirilization of men. There's also moderate evidence that it leads to breast and uterine cancer, as well as ADHD, decreased testosterone, low birth weight, and lots of other issues. And there's some evidence of other things like preterm birth, reduced estradiol, and things like that, that just turns out we just need more research on. And then of course, going back to our sort of life cycle assessment from the Stitch website, is a case study on shipping crates, which I highly encourage you to look at. And so here it shows sort of the carbon footprint of different types of shipping crates and what each element of the shipping crate contributes to its overall environmental impact. And the difference between the two figures is actually just the reduction in density of the packing foam. And so you can see the purple represents the interior. And so figure 3B shows that they just use less dense packing foam. And that gave a considerable reduction in its overall carbon footprint. Part of our study is also to investigate alternative materials. So we will be testing biofoams and bioplastics as well as other materials as an alternative to the plastics that are being used in crate packing material. In addition, we're doing a material use analysis. We'll look at the financial cost and compare that to material performance in our studies of thermal and moisture buffering. And we'll also look at the material afterlife in terms of does it go to waste, can it be reused, and can it be recycled? And all of this is done in order to allow collecting institutions to make informed and cost-efficient, as well as environmentally responsible decisions for maintaining preservation standards and mitigating damage and risk when shipping their paper-based objects. I'd like to thank our project team. We have a wonderful team of folks here at Image Permanence Institute working on this project. I'd like to thank the Institute of Museum and Library Services for funding, and a big thank you to all of our partner institutions who are letting us put temperature and humidity data loggers in their crates and just being so wonderful and cooperating and collaborating with us. If any of you out there who are listening are interested in this topic or are putting data loggers in your crates, I would be very happy to talk to you and look at your data, hear how you're handling this issue as well. Are you using alternative materials? I'd be very happy to discuss this with you. So feel free to reach out to me. That is all I have. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Al. Yeah, crates are such an interesting thing because like we all have to deal with them, right? Like they're everywhere. And we wanted to make sure to include you in this program because it was the use of crates within all of our institutions. They're everywhere. The fact that damage can happen during transit, we all know that, like that's one of the big damager type things, certain things. And then also how crates are used. I mean, at least I have, where when you're dealing with disaster prep and disaster, just anything, recovery, if you can find crates to use for storage and anything, you're going to use them too. So it felt like a good combination of topics to talk about, you know, these issues that we're having with the crates and kind of how we need to be better about how we use them. So thank you for presenting on that for sure.
Yeah, thank you.
So we have a few questions rolling in, but we're going to give people a few minutes to type their questions for, you know, just give the audience a few minutes to do that. Until then, though, I wanted to go back through the chat and I was looking at some of the tips, like some of the things you guys put in. So after Lorraine's talk, she had asked you all to start sharing some ideas of what people can do. Some of the ones that were included are buy supplies made of recyclable materials. And they also enjoyed the great tip on the gloves and boots. Reuse hard hats and minimize reprinting, which I think, I know when I came up in the 90s, how many people, which you still see in the bottoms of emails, don't print out this email, like just like keep it. So I'm very behind that one. For glove recycling, someone says, oh, those gloves, they're going to be filling them with sand, so much better than lead shot and safer too. So they're talking about when they're reusing the gloves, kind of how to reuse them and what to do. What have you seen, especially over in the UK, Lorraine? How many are other institutions adopting these practices? Is it widespread, or do you see a movement kind of growing over there? I know we're seeing it here in the States for sure.
Yeah, it's definitely a movement. Yeah, very much so. Gloves remain the perennial problem, mainly because most institutions are so small that they don't generate enough in terms of waste to justify paying into the TerraCycle scheme. So what I feel that we really need to do is try and get some way of sharing it, so we have a central point. And if you've got several regional museums that can actually access that, then to be able to access that recycling. But really it's more a question of not using them in the first place. And there was an intern at Northumbria University. She was their first sustainability intern. She's on the course there. And she said, well, I'm only using one glove because I have one glove that's touching and the other hand has got my paintbrush in. So that's a 50% reduction.
Oh, that's a really good point. I like
Yeah.
that a lot. Nice. A couple other, I also liked your point about rechargeable batteries and solar chargers. I know for me in my hurricane kit, we always try to have solar powered or rechargeable things floating around because at a certain point, the batteries have vaporized from all of our supply things. So it's nice to have rechargeable things floating around as well. Were there any tips that you saw, Lena, that you liked or anything in particular?
Sorry, I have the Q&A up.
Good.
I might actually dive into that and then we can kind of weave back and forth. But this first question is reusable plywood traveling crate versus plastic traveling crate. What is worse? So I think this question's for Al.
That's a good question. The answer is at this point, I don't know yet at this point in the research. But I can tell you that, eventually with both, you can only reuse them to a certain point before they're just structurally not efficient anymore, not going to safeguard your collection. I have a friend who is a chief preparator, and all of their plastic crates that they can no longer use for transit, she repurposes for garden planters, and has got tomatoes growing in them. So there can be a life beyond. You don't necessarily want to plant your food in plywood. My garden planters, I use non-pressure treated wood because I don't want the formaldehyde in there. With that said, I don't know about the phthalates migrating into the soil from plastic too. So I think you're kind of, there's pluses and minuses to both. You just have to choose what works best for you. And I will say that we are looking at alternate crate construction materials too, that are neither plastic nor plywood.
Thank you. And I think this next question could go to all of you in case any of you know. The question is about how long do nitrile gloves last in storage? Does anybody have an idea?
I can't give you an exact, but we have some gloves that were ordered in bulk probably, 20 years ago or so. And some of them you put them on and they rip. So I don't know. I don't know at what point they went rip, but they do now. Yeah.
I would just say the same as Al, like just from experience inheriting gloves in the lab that were over 20 years old, that they ripped and they were a little crunchy. Like they just, yeah, there's definitely a point somewhere in there that they go bad, but I don't yet know what that point is.
Someone in the chat says I call it this too, the interwebs says 5 to 10 years for the life of gloves. So yeah, it's always funny to me because it's always, I'm sure some of you all have experienced this too, or our audience even, that sometimes people will only order like the extra large gloves, and you'll have all these people walking around with these not able to fit on your hand gloves at all, but you end up just using them because you have to, which is always a good time. But it is interesting that it says about 5 years or so. And then someone also said we came back from the pandemic closures and theirs were all ripped. So I guess there was even a shorter shelf life for some people. Looks like another question just popped into the Q&A. Elena, would you like to read it?
Yeah, this one is thoughts on single-use conservation materials. So that's open to all of our speakers.
Silence is deafening.
What is a single-use conservation item? Because there is nothing that I use in my practice that I've only ever used once. If it's been used once, it might be a piece of repair tissue that's actually been attached to an object, and therefore I have only used it once, but it's still attached to the object. There's very little in my practice that I use once and then dispose of, but I can see in maybe some studios that's the case.
Someone in the chat just said maybe cotton swabs. might be an example. I think that brings up a good point though, Lorraine, is that sometimes you almost have to rewire your brain a little bit when you look at things and kind of sit there and start considering like, okay, well, can I reuse these things? Or can, you know, especially if you're brought up in consumable culture world, which I know I was, that sometimes you have to sit there and say, no, wait, we can reuse these items. We can use the other side of printed pieces of paper. You know, that kind of a thought process you have to kind of undergo. And it's sometimes it's hard to kind of get your leadership to accept these ideas because they think, well, we can go out and buy more. So I think that's a good thing, is trying to learn how to teach others how to reuse these items. I think is an important part of this as well.
My bone folder that I've had since I trained, and I graduated in 1995, so it's quite some time ago. So my very favorite bone folder, which has now taken on the shape of my hand, is actually a Victorian letter opener. So that's what, you know, 120 years old now. That's still going strong.
Wow, that's impressive. That's for sure.
With the cotton swabs, one thing that I've been trying to do more is, especially when you're working fast and you have to go through a lot of things, it's very handy to have the pre-made cotton swabs that are on the sticks, but I've been trying in recent years to really move away from that and just rolling your own swabs, because then you're just throwing away that little tiny piece of cotton instead of the whole stick with it. So that's one way you can kind of move away from that a little bit.
I think somebody's trialing textile, so cotton textile, in replacement for cotton swabs. So how well that's going, I don't know, but I know somebody is trying it.
Just saw something. I was thinking back to, Lorraine, to when you were talking about where people store their emergency kits and how they do it. Where, in your guys' experience, to the rest of the panelists, where do you all currently store emergency kits around your facility? Or do you think, where do you like to see emergency kits stored within the facility?
We have ours really spread. I mean, like we have 3 buildings and they're really spread throughout all the rooms in the building. So depending on where a disaster is happening, you know, we have multiple entrances. So it depends on where you're going and what's going to be the closest. So I mean, we have them at the entrance to all of our storerooms. We have them at the entrance to all of our, you know, labs or processing spaces. We have them in our security stations. And then in each of our galleries, we also have one in the entrance to each gallery. So they're really spread out at our institutions.
Yeah, I think that's good practice, especially if you have multiple buildings, to have as many as you can kind of spread out throughout the facility. Al, do you guys have emergency kits where you're working or where you work at?
Well, we're a research lab, so not really, which isn't to say that we haven't had water emergencies. Sometimes our equipment brings a leak. So I'm thinking maybe we should have one, but right now we have a mop.
It is funny you mentioned that, because whenever people are talking about building scenarios, it's always like water event, because even if you like are in the desert, you can still have a leak pipe. It can still be like water event, because like everyone gets to deal with those sometimes, which is always a fun time.
We're talking about the kits and where the kits are stored. It reminds me of when I was employed, and we had 3 sets of keys to the museum, the library and archive store, which was all in one building. But all 3 sets of keys were stored in that building overnight. So if there was a disaster, we had a fire, for example, all you could end up with is like 3 lumps of metal. So it took some time, but eventually we convinced the director to move a set of keys over to the conservation studio, which was in a separate building. So should something awful happen, we could still get in the building.
Yeah, that happens a lot, I think. It's, you know, and it's always super interesting to me that until you almost hit a disaster, or until someone new comes into the facility, they might realize that there's like a huge issue with either gaining access or getting into things. That often happens. I know I've worked at some places where they were rather remote, and we would realize that the main person who had access to everything like lived an hour and a half away, and you'd be like, well, okay, disaster's really happening, then that's going to be an issue, because like we can't wait for you to commute like to get over somewhere. So yeah, that's something that happens a lot.
It's like, oh, sorry.
Oh, no, go
I was
ahead.
just going to add that I feel like our disaster kits and what we think about is always evolving, because we just recently realized that all of our kits have hard hats in them. But then nobody's going to go into the buildings that far to retrieve a hard hat. So we're now like reevaluating our kits and being like, well, we need a storage area close to the entrance where we just keep the hard hats, because that doesn't make sense. So yeah, we're constantly kind of evaluating these things too.
I don't think, at least I've learned over my time with experience with these, is that it's constantly like you are constantly tweaking it, right? And realizing, okay, well, that didn't work. Maybe we need to rethink this. That didn't work. Maybe we need to rethink this. So yeah, I completely agree with that. Someone in the chat also says another way to increase your chances is to have annual coffee with first responders to share what we would do and what they would do in case of an emergency. That's always like, make friends with the first responders, because that is always an incredibly helpful thing to do as well.
They should also know where your collections are. So if they do have to put a water hose on your building, to be thoughtful about where.
Yeah, very much so.
And following on from what Krista said about reevaluating, there was a very large fire, a major fire in the library in Norwich in 1992. I mean, the fire station was next door to the library. And even by the time that they'd managed to get to the building, it was out of control. But I knew the senior conservator there, because the archive was stored in the basement, because aren't they always? But it was 2 days before they were allowed access to the building. So for me, the idea that sometimes you might need to grab stuff off your emergency kit, quite often the emergency might be happening, but it takes a while before you're allowed in the building because it needs to be made safe.
Yep, absolutely right. Oh, someone also said in the chat, National Heritage Responders, which I'm a member of. We have go bags. It might be a good concept for institutional responders as well. This way, response PPE and some basic supplies are held by individuals at home, so there will always be some materials not impacted by the disaster. Yeah, that's always a good idea to have, like, when you're buying your emergency kits, to maybe have a little extra money in there for go packs. You know what I mean? Like, I think those are quite useful to have, especially if you do live far away from your institution. They're nice to have around there for sure. Someone also mentioned, also can't emphasize enough the importance of fire suppressant training. Most staff have actually never used one. And I know I've had training with 2 different types. One looked like a barbecue grill, essentially, where it was a propane setup and they let us actually spray water on them and learn how to do it. And then later on, they got an electronic one, which wasn't nearly as much fun, but it basically had light sensors on it that told you how to do it. But fire departments usually have those. They usually like to come out and do training, which are always a good time. Okay. People are trading materials in the chat, which is wonderful. So that's great. Well, I don't see any more questions coming in, so I think we're going to wrap it up for today. Does anyone have any final thoughts or anything else they'd like to pass around to the audience? I will encourage you, and I think Elaine has put it in there a few times, the survey to win a wheel or a C2C Care course registration, all part of prep, the May Day prep program. Like we said, this can be your one activity, so you can enter to win one of those things if you want to. So please, please, please go fill that out. We also I put in a little earlier, a link to the resource list and the C2C Care survey. We're always encouraging responses to that as we look at C2C Care and see as we change the program. Does anyone else have any final thoughts about the subject today, and just little things that you can do to kind of help out with sustainability when it comes to disaster prep? Anyone want to add anything? I really appreciate everything that everyone did today. This was all great. And like we said before, small actions are always incredibly important to do. So we appreciate all the steps everyone is taking to that. Well, I'm going to go ahead and call it for today. Thank you to FAIC. Thank you to all of our presenters. Thank you to IMLS, who also supports our program. So as always, thank you to them. And if anyone has any questions, please reach out to us at c2cc@culturalheritage.org, and we'll be sure to get back to you as soon as possible. So everyone have a safe May, and we will see you back in June for Care of Musical Instruments. So thanks, and talk to you all soon.